Hello, BookTube.
Hello, BookTube. It's Roz from Scully Dandling About the Books.
And Tilly from Tilly's Shelf, and we're back for another Discussing Drama.
With this month's tremendously interesting play, which was suggested. Oh, look, we can do matching. Oh, there we go.
Matching books.
Matching books. Which was suggested by Courtney Ferreter. So thank you, Courtney, for suggesting a book, a play that we could read for Women's History Month.
It was an absolutely exceptional suggestion, so I'm very glad that she recommended it, and I would recommend it as well because it's a very, very quick read. I would say just go ahead and read it. We're going to be covering spoilers in this discussion today because it's quite hard to analyze the play, I think, without talking about the whole story of it. So either read it or you can watch performances on YouTube. They're only about half an hour long. If you just search for Trifles by Susan Glaspell, which is in fact the name of the play, then yeah, you can just watch it and then come and join us for the discussion after that.
Yeah, but if we didn't give the whole plot, it would be really hard to talk about it. So we will.
Should we say a little bit about what that plot is then for those people who haven't just watched it?
Oh, I'm just doing that. You want me to do
decide?
that?
No, you can do it.
Okay, so this is the plot is that a man has been found dead in his bed, and his wife, that's John Wright, his wife Minnie Wright, was sitting downstairs in the rocking chair in a state of sort of distress and confusion. She's a neighbouring farmer. They're on a farm, an isolated rural farm. A neighbouring farmer pops in and finds her and finds this out. And the play is when the next day, the sheriff and the district attorney county attorney come to visit the house, bringing the farmer who found her and the body, and to look for, trying to find out sort of evidence. But they bring with them the farmer's wife, Mrs. Hale, from the neighbouring farm, and the sheriff's wife, because the idea is that she's going to get some bits and pieces that the Mrs. Wright, the supposed murderess, will need. So that's the setup, and the plot is that the sheriff and the farmer and the attorney are hopping around, kind of looking for what might have happened and trying to find evidence for, or a motive for why she may have done this that might mean they can convict her. And the two women who didn't previously know each other are kind of in the farmhouse kitchen, but they are looking, observing and noticing the detail that kind of reveals what really happened, and why Minnie probably did murder her husband. Yeah. That's the setup.
So those are all the key characters. Should we talk a little bit about then Susan Glaspell, who was the author? Yes. So she was brought up in rural Iowa, and that's, I guess, quite important for how we see her as an author. The era in which she was writing was a time of sort of regionalism in American writing, and she is seen as being a writer of the Midwest and being able to convey that kind of Midwestern context and mentality to a certain extent through her work.
Shall I say she was born in 1876 and died in 1948? So you get the period.
The time period, yes, sorry. Yeah. She, despite being, born in rural Iowa and the daughter of a haymaker, she actually successfully went to Drake University, didn't just go to university, she got a PhD in philosophy. So she was obviously, very intelligent and very committed to pursuing her education. And then she went on to become a journalist and wrote for, I think it was Des Moines News or something like that. I didn't write it down. So Trifles was the first play she ever wrote after she had stopped being a journalist and started the Provincetown Players with her husband and a group of other sort of progressives in New York. She actually wrote it very quickly for the end of the season. She was apparently under some pressure from her husband to get it written. So because of that, it makes it even more impressive that she put this really short but very powerful one-act play together in a short amount of time, and then immediately it was performed in 1916. Shall I talk about the trial?
Well, yeah, I think it would be, I mean, it's really interesting to know that she wrote it in 1916, but it was based on her experience as a reporter in 1900, reporting on an actual murder along these lines. Do you want to say more about the trial?
Yes, so as a journalist, she was reporting on the trial of Margaret Hossack. So Margaret Hossack supposedly, most probably, murdered her husband in bed and was sentenced to life in prison in 1900. So Glaspell covered the case for many months, and you can see from her reporting of it that she changed her opinion over time from reporting it as, you know, simply an interesting murder case and, you know, scandal and intrigue and all of that, to actually having some deeper kind of social opinions about it. She actually went and visited the farm, and that was kind of a turning point in her reporting where she started to see the issue as it really was. I think it's worth saying that it was a large trial with a big reputation. There were a lot of witnesses called, there were a lot of spectators. Mrs. Hossack's premarital pregnancy was viewed as a key piece of evidence because it showed that she was not a trustworthy woman, and that was given more weight than the fact that she was rumoured to have experienced quite a lot of violence within her marriage. And in fact, the violence and abuse that she experienced was seen as giving her a motive for murder rather than seen as being any kind of extenuating circumstance or any kind of you know, context to why she might have I was going to say needed to murder her husband, but that's probably the wrong way of putting it. But what would have pushed her to do that, I suppose.
Yeah.
And
what is really striking is that you know, Susan Glaspell had been working as a reporter up to that point. At this point, she resigns from her role as a reporter. She stops doing it. It's obvious that reporting on this trial and coming to understand about the issues of domestic abuse behind the trial had a very profound effect on her and really shaped her, in a sense, her thinking about it was one of the things that appears to have made her a pioneering feminist.
Yeah. And it was a story that she returned to repeatedly as well. So obviously this happened in 1900. She returned to it in 1916 to write this play. She also then went on to adapt the play into a short story in A Jury of Her Peers, which is also included in this edition. So it was something that stayed in her mind quite significantly for quite some time. And I'm really glad that it did, because it brought out this very impactful play.
Yeah. And it's a very short play. It's about sort of half an hour long. It's all one scene, small cast, one room. It all happens in one room, you know. So it's one of those plays. It's like it's deceptively simple, but actually has a lot of impact and a lot of sort of depth, I think. Yeah. As a first ever piece of dramatic writing by someone, it's very impressive, isn't it? Yeah,
it really is. Yeah. So it was described as a parable of crime and justice by the American feminist literary critic Elaine Showalter, and I thought that kind of sums it up quite well. It's like a one sentence about, you know, what it is, what it's about, this idea of justice, and like what is criminal justice versus moral justice, I suppose.
Yeah. And in the play, in effect, the men symbolize the sort of criminal justice system and a sort of traditional way of seeing, you know, that, and the two women in the play come to think of it in terms of moral justice.
Yeah. So for a bit of context, I suppose, from the time period, women did not have the right to vote, and in most states did not have the ability to sit on juries. And they also had no protection from domestic abuse. So as the play goes on, as in the title of the book, the story A Jury of Her Peers, effectively the women review the evidence and become that jury for Minnie Wright, and decide to effectively become an accessory after the fact and disguise her motive for murder in the hope that it will either alleviate her sentence or not, you know, lead to her not being convicted.
It would be easy if it modernized to misunderstand that. You might think, oh well, it would make sense to bring forth the evidence that they find that she was, you know, that he was abusive and symbolically threatened her life. They find her dead canary, I think we should say, and this was the one we really come to realize, this was the one kind of happy thing in her life, that she had the canary. It's symbolic of her as an individual, because the Mrs. Hale, the farmer, knows that when Minnie was younger, she was a singer. She loved singing. So when he breaks the canary's neck, that was a real explicit, we would say it was a really explicit threat to kill for her. So nowadays you think, oh, that would be kind of mitigating information, but on the contrary, the men in the play are looking for evidence of her motive for killing him, and they're worried that they won't be able to convict her if they don't find the motive. So in suppressing the motive, the women are choosing to protect her. The cat is scratching the door to try and get out, making open the door.
And I'll talk about domestic violence, I guess. So some of the discussion around the play has been around whether she had a justification for killing him, and I was very surprised to watch a YouTube video from a female literature lecturer, where she said that in the modern day we wouldn't have sympathy for her because she could have just left because she'd have had legal rights. And it was like, oh no, how can you think that? How can you still think that? Because
do you know nothing about how domestic abuse works?
Even if physically it's easier for her to get a divorce, for instance, through modern legal systems, it doesn't mean that coercive control isn't in effect, that woman wouldn't feel trapped. So I think we can definitely, even today, have a great deal of sympathy for Minnie Wright. And there's a lot of talk about the character of Mr. Wright, and he's described as being a good man, but in terms of he pays his debts, but nothing that actually kind of shows his character and whether he was a good husband. I think we can interpret from the way that Minnie Wright is described as having gone from being this happy, pretty, singing girl to being somebody who's patching up her clothes, who never sees her neighbours, who is living in this cold, isolated house. We can really see that idea of the control that we associate with domestic violence at play, and just talking about that, the canary, the dead canary, and how it kind of is symbolic of the canary in its cage is symbolic of Minnie Wright in her house. In the modern day, we would recognize that where somebody is known to perpetrate violence against a pet, it's often seen as a warning sign that things could escalate towards violence towards a human. And we do not know in the play whether or not that has happened. We don't know whether he's ever been physically violent towards her, or whether it has just all been this very present emotional control that we can tell is there.
So should we talk about the title of the play, Trifles? Because that sounds kind of jolly. If you
I was really at first I was really expecting there to be some kind of trifle in the play, a trifle. I thought, part of a cult domesticity, role of the homemaker, she was going to have been making this trifle. Obviously, completely no, that's not what happened.
Not that kind of trifles. But so there's a line in the play quite early on where one of the men kind of says of the two women, oh, well, they're talking about trifling concerns that, women. Do you want to read it?
Yeah, it's Hale, Mr. Hale. Well, women are used to worrying over trifles, and this is when they're talking about her preserves having cracked and smashed, and so all of the fruit that she's been laying up for winter has been damaged, and they describe that as worrying about trifles.
Yeah.
Do you want to carry on? So
well, and so the double meaning or whatever of the title is that, so then if you picture the structure of the play, you've got the kitchen come living room with the two women in it, and the men are running around in and out looking. They're going upstairs and out to the barn because they're looking to find out what happened and the real business. They're doing the stuff, and the women are in the kitchen looking at small domestic details, the trifles. But it's through those that they come to understand what happened. They form a real picture. They work out through those trifling details the reality of the story, and it's through that we build up a sense of the character of John Wright and Minnie Wright, and what their life together was like.
And the men are shown as being almost quite ridiculous, like, oh, we must check the windows and things like that. Whereas, and very, very dismissive of these, the trifles that the women are worrying about, without really kind of taking into account the importance of those trifles. In terms of when Minnie Wright was preparing those preserves, what she was doing was safeguarding her family over the winter. Like, she was really like laying up food in a place that's very, very isolated and very cold for many months of the year. She's, you know, preparing food for the Hunger Gap. She's, you know, keeping the family going. So this massive dismissing of all of those details, it's painful.
Oh, absolutely. And the men are really kind of like keen to criticize Minnie's like housekeeping, you know, and because like there's, you know, the dishes haven't been washed, and, you know, but obviously, you know, she was interrupted in the middle of doing what she would normally do, and that criticism, it's interesting. That's one of the things that brings the two, Mrs. Hale and the sheriff's wife, Miss Peters, brings them. They don't know each other, but they instinctively react against that, and that pushes them into greater sympathy with each other, because they both sort of say, well, I wouldn't like someone to just come into my kitchen when I've been, you know, I hadn't had a chance to set it to rights, and, you know, pull me apart, my character apart, because I haven't done the washing up. You know, that's the implication. And
and there's two things about that for me is, like, there's actually quite a few interrupted tasks in the play, and also in A Jury of Her Peers, she kind of points out a few more. There's like a bag of sugar that she's started pouring into a jar and hasn't finished, and there's this quilt that I'm sure we'll talk about more that she started but hasn't finished. There's bread that she's got set to go but hasn't put it into the bread bin, and to me, she's halfway through cleaning the table. To me, I get the impression that all of these are like tasks that she's trying to do, and then her husband comes in, and her husband coming in is an interruption in itself, and something that means that she can't just do the things that she needs to do, for instance. The other thing I was going to mention as well, was that when we talk about Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters coming together, she quite adeptly like puts that into the stage directions as well. So when Mr. Hale says women are used to worrying about trifles, it literally says, from Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, from coming in pretty opposed to each other. One's a farmer's wife, one's the sheriff's wife. They don't really know each other. They physically take steps closer together, and like that, like they kind of close ranks in a way. So then you start getting this unity between them, and unity with the absent Minnie Wright as well.
Yeah, which is why you can absolutely see it as a kind of a proto-feminist drama. I really identified with that in the play.
And you have these two women, like, as you said, they're present in the kitchen all of the time. The men are moving around, so you get this kind of like this sense of the lives of women static in the kitchen, but observing and able to pick up on all these details while the men are kind of careering about and in and out. Kind of mimics the domestic arrangements of the time, I suppose.
You mentioned the quilt, and one of the things that I like about the play, and that I felt, even though it's a very short play and in some ways, you know, seems, as I say, simple on the surface, there's some really great sort of symbolism going on in the play. And we talked about the canary, but the quilt is another, isn't it? So they find her like work basket with her quilt pieces, and she was making a log cabin quilt, and it's this, for me, and I think for any reader, I think just this incredible symbol of her trying to build a safe and warm and stable home.
It's a log cabin pattern, so it's like this impression of like something warm, cozy, like what a Midwest home is supposed to be, which is obviously not what she's got.
And making the best of things, you know, patching things together, and then they look at it and they see it's really beautifully sewn, and then in places there's like it missing stitches and it's gone wrong, and it's like is another of those interruptions. It's like, you know, it's as if he came and threw her off and she couldn't sew properly when he was being abusive, and you can physically see that in this log cabin quilt.
I think it's interesting that it says that Mrs. Hale unpicks those stitches, which is the first thing she starts to do in terms of disguising the evidence. But I don't think, even if she hadn't unpicked those stitches, I don't think that would ever have been picked up on by the county attorney. I don't think that's like whether he could have identified good stitching and bad stitching.
Wouldn't have understood.
But Mrs. Hale intuitively knows, like straight away, this indicates that something wasn't right.
And it's in doing that she discovers the body of the canary, and there's something about that patching together, that like the two women, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, patch together Minnie's history in the same way as they sew it back together almost. So I loved it as an image.
You were talking about the preserves as well. I think that was a very
preserves. So Minnie's done this amazing job of preserving things in jars, fruits, cherries, all of those things, and there's a lot of labor have gone into that. And then in the cold, because the fire was allowed to go out in the house after she was taken away to the jail, in the cold, almost all of those jars have exploded. And that, to me, that really spoke of the sort of
bottling up
of emotions, and being compressed and held and restrained, and trying to hold things together, and trying to conserve your life and your basic needs in life, and then the coldness making you
explodes. And that's evidently what's happened. Like it's got up to the point where she can't take it anymore, and she can't live it anymore, whether that's because she's feeling increasingly like her own life is at threat, or whether that's just the pressure on her has become too much.
And I don't like to sound like you and I think it's perfectly fine to murder an abusive man, but I think we have a good understanding of how and why that might happen, and that you shouldn't see someone who does that as being culpable of a sort of premeditated murder, as it were. That's not what it is. So
it's about understanding why it was done, and taking in all of the nuances of the crime and the case, and also an awareness of the other crimes that took place. So if he was violent towards her, he was committing crimes, but also crimes that are not necessarily can be taken to a court of law. So Mrs. Hale talks about how it's a crime that she never came and visited her friend, even though they lived so close together, because she didn't want to come into the house that she knew was unhappy. And she's like, well, which court is going to try me for that? And like all of the other factors that come into that situation.
Oh, carry on. Sorry,
I finished.
All right. Sorry.
I think I've actually managed to cover most of my notes.
Yeah. Well, no. What I was going to say was that we understand that in our 21st century understanding about domestic abuse and so on. What is so striking is that Susan Glaspell was.
In 1916.
In 1916, when she wrote this, and it was seen as a daring play at the time. I mean, I don't think we see it as daring now. And I think you've watched some performances, and it is quite often used for amateur performance because it's quite short, with and very an easy set to produce. It's very manageable for an amateur theatre company. But and we perhaps wouldn't see it as daring now, and because it's kind of it's quite domestic in a way, but actually in its ideas it was phenomenally daring at the time it was written. What I found quite sad was that Susan Glaspell was this was a really well received play. Her novels were really thought of. They were like critically acclaimed bestsellers. Another of her plays got a Pulitzer Prize. She was a big name, and I hadn't even heard of her. Now, obviously Courtney had, because and she is American, and I do know that we're much less well informed about American playwrights here than you know, because you know we have British and Irish ones that we focus on. But what actually happened was she really fell out of favour in the 1940s, and towards the end of her life, and you know was just sort of dismissed really.
Yeah, and was only rediscovered more recently.
Yeah. So, would we recommend it?
Definitely.
I'd
say it's
100%.
Yeah, it's a very commonly studied play these days, apparently. And when I'm doing my research, I saw loads and loads of comments of people saying, oh, I'm so bored of this play. I wish I didn't have to be studying this play. If you're in that position, if that's you, read it and love it and appreciate it, because it's so short as a play to have to read for your studies. It's really not that bad, but there is so much in there. There's so much character. There's so much like pent up frustration and stress. And yeah, I think it's brilliant.
Yeah. So thank you for the recommendation, Courtney. And our plan is that we will put this video up on the 8th of March because
International Women's Day.
Yeah. So we're putting this up for all the women booktubers and the male allies.
And I just wanted to finish off
and obviously all our non-binary booktubers too. So
I just want to finish on a bit of a happy ending for Margaret Hossack, who was obviously the inspiration behind Minnie Wright in this play. In 1903, she was able to appeal, and the jury couldn't reach a conclusion. So she was released. So she only served 2 or 3 years of her sentence, and she was able to go back home to her children. So yeah, I guess a happy ending for her. Yeah. One hopes.
Yeah, of sorts. Yeah.
Of sorts.
Okay, I'll stop recording.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.